watching the river go by, watching the river go by, watching the river go by in the evening, watching the river go by, watching the river go by, watching the river go by in the evening. Now he was an old bachelor who never married, and she was an old maid who never married either. He was an old school teacher who lived all alone, and she lived next door, and she lived alone too. They'd known each other for all of their lives. They played together when they were little kids, and they both were a living in the houses they grew up on the banks and facing the Ohio River. In the long evenings of their middle age, he'd either go to her house or she'd go to his, and they'd sit on the porch side by side, never touching, never even as much as holding hands. They'd just be watching the river go by. They'd be watching the river go by, watching the river go by in the evening, watching the river go by, watching the river go by, watching the river go by in the evening. He knew all the boats and who was in the cruise. She'd listen to old stories she'd heard so many times before. His daddy was a captain of a steamboat on the river, but that was long ago in his memory. They just watch the river go by, watch the river go by. They'd be watching the river roll by in the evening, watching the river roll by, watching the river roll by. They'd be watching the river go by in the evening. And the sweet river breeze, it played around their knees and caressed tightly their skin. And sometimes they'd sit for an hour or so, and sometimes till way past 10, just watching the river roll by, watching the river roll by. They'd be watching the river roll by in the evening, watching the river go by. They'd be watching the river go by. They'd be watching the river go by in the evening. Now they didn't do this in the dead of summer, oh, and they didn't want to do it in the dead of winter either, because they didn't want to freeze or get bitten by mosquitoes. And some nights it'd just be right, she'd show up her bathrobe, and they'd be watching the river go by, watching the river go by. They'd be watching the river go by in the evening, watching the river go by. They'd be watching